The Forgotten Cartridge, Wario Land 3. It started on an unremarkable weekend. I was visiting my parents' house, a place I hadn't been in years. My childhood bedroom was untouched, frozen in time, a museum of a simpler life. Among the cluttered shelves and dusty books, I found my old Game Boy Color. I hadn't thought about it in ages, but seeing it brought a pang of nostalgia. I decided to search for some games to pass the time. Digging through a battered cardboard box, I found several cartridges, Pokemon Red, Tetris, and then one I didn't recognize. It was unmarked, save for faint scratches where a label had once been. The shape of the cartridge was unmistakable, though. This was Wario Land 3. I used to play it obsessively as a kid, though my memories of it were oddly hazy. Something about treasure, maybe. I popped the cartridge into the Game Boy and powered it on. It took a few tries, but finally, the familiar Nintendo logo appeared. Then the title screen loaded, only it wasn't quite right. The cheerful music I remembered was gone, replaced by a low droning hum. The screen flickered slightly, and the 3 in the title seemed to pulse, almost as if it were breathing. I felt a chill, but brushed it off as a quirk of the aging hardware. When the game started, things seemed relatively normal. Wario's sprite looked as crude and cartoony as I remembered, and the map of the world had the same surreal charm. But as I moved Wario through the first level, a creeping unease began to set in. The background music was distorted, playing notes that didn't belong. The sky, which should have been bright and colorful, was a muted gray, with faint shifting shapes that almost looked like faces. I thought it was a glitch. These old cartridges could be temperamental after all. The first level ended without incident, though it struck me as oddly barren. Enemies moved sluggishly, almost reluctantly, and there were fewer treasures to collect than I remembered. When I entered the second level, the changes became harder to ignore. The music stopped entirely. The sound effects were muted, like they were coming from far away. As I moved Wario forward, the screen dimmed slightly, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a faint figure in the background. It was indistinct, a silhouette that flickered in and out of view, always just out of reach. At first, I thought it was an enemy, but it didn't move. It simply watched. I told myself it was a trick of the graphics, maybe a corrupted sprite. But as I continued, the figure became more pronounced. It grew larger, closer, until I could make out details, a hunched posture, unnaturally long limbs, and hollow, sunken eyes. My hands started to sweat, but I couldn't look away. Then came the whispering, faint at first, just a hiss that I assumed was static from the Game Boy speaker. But as I progressed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't in English or any language I recognized, but they carried an undeniable malice. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around me like a cold fog. I paused the game and set the Game Boy down, heart racing. I told myself I was imagining things. I even laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. But when I looked at the screen, the pause menu was gone. Wario was standing in a pitch-black void, staring directly at me. His normally goofy expression was twisted into something unrecognizable, his grin stretched too wide, his eyes bulging as if he were in pain. I shut the Game Boy off, but the screen stayed lit. Wario's face lingered, flickering and glitching, before the screen abruptly went dark. I sat there for a long moment, unsure of what had just happened. Despite my better judgment, I turned the Game Boy back on. The Nintendo logo appeared again, but this time it was smeared, as if it were melting. The title screen didn't load. Instead, I was dropped into what looked like the map screen, but it was different. The colorful landscape was gone, replaced by a barren wasteland. The ground was cracked and dry, and the sky was an oppressive blood-red hue. There was only one level available, marked by an icon of Wario's face. I selected it, and the screen transitioned with a distorted screech. The level began in complete silence. Wario stood in a desolate field, the ground littered with what looked like broken toys and shattered gold coins. As I moved him forward, the screen began to shake, and the figure from before reappeared, no longer in the background. It stood directly in Wario's path, towering over him. The figure's face was now fully visible. It wasn't a monster or a creature, it was Wario, or rather, a twisted, nightmarish version of him. Its features were exaggerated, grotesque. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. Its eyes were black pits, dripping with inky tears that streaked down its bloated cheeks. I tried to turn the game off again, but the power button didn't respond. The game continued, forcing me to confront the creature. It didn't attack or move. It simply stared, its head tilting slightly as if it were studying me. Then the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. They weren't coming from the Game Boy anymore. They were in the room, surrounding me. I felt cold fingers brush the back of my neck, but when I turned, nothing was there. On the screen, Wario collapsed to his knees. The grotesque doppelganger loomed closer, its grin widening until it split its face in two. Text appeared at the bottom of the screen, written jagged, uneven letters. He doesn't belong here. Neither do you. The screen went black. When I finally managed to turn the Game Boy off, I ripped the cartridge out and threw it back into the box. I didn't sleep that night, haunted by the whispers and the image of that twisted Wario. The next day I tried to tell myself it was just a glitchy game, a corrupted save file. But when I went back to the box to get rid of it, the cartridge was gone. All that was left was an empty, dust-covered space where it should have been, and a faint whisper echoing in the silence.